My name is Yulia. If someone had told me 10 years ago how all this would turn out, I would have just laughed. I grew up in a seemingly ordinary family. My father was busy with his business all day making windows, and my mother managed the household. We lived comfortably but without excess. My father rarely talked about work. He came home late and asked my mother about school. At that time, I didn't even think that things could be different. But when I was 22, everything changed. I had just graduated from university with no clear idea of what to do next. One day, passing by my father's office, I heard his tense voice, "Absolutely not. I won't let you take over my company. I've invested too much in this business." It felt like an electric shock. A stranger's voice on the phone replied, but I couldn't make out the words. My chest tightened with anxiety. My father never talked about problems, but now, looking at him over dinner, I realized something was wrong. He joked with my mother as usual, but his smile wasn't genuine. The name Ruslan Kerimov surfaced everywhere, a wealthy and dangerous businessman whose office was just a couple of blocks away. I found myself facing his stern secretary. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked coldly. "No, but it's very important," I lied. She made a call, then said top floor. The elevator seemed to rise too quickly, or maybe it was just my nerves. The doors opened, and there he was. "And who do we have here?" Ruslan Kerimov drawled, his eyes assessing me. "Yulia Orlova," I said. "I want to talk about my father's company." Interest flickered in Kerimov's eyes as I sat across from him at his massive desk. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I think we can come to an agreement. I will leave your father's company alone if you marry my son." I was stunned. "Excuse me, what?" I managed to say. "You heard me correctly," he replied. I left his office in complete turmoil. Marry for business? He was crazy. But the next day, I found myself back in his office. "So, Miss Orlova," Kerimov said, leaning forward with a satisfied smile, "I'm glad you've come to your senses." He introduced me to his son, Elder, who was nothing like I expected, tall, with tousled dark hair and a slightly uncertain but genuine smile. You must be Yulia," he said, extending his hand. His father left us alone to get acquainted. As soon as the door closed, Elder sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Look, I'm sorry about this," he said. "My father has unique views." I nodded silently, agreeing that we were both adults and could handle this. Our relationship began like any ordinary couple's: dinners, walks, movies, but without the romance. We both knew it was a game, a performance we had to see through to the end. 6 months later, I stood under the wedding canopy. My father beamed with pride, unaware of the cost of saving his business. There was friendship, at least. The wedding reception passed in a blur. At one point, Elder's mother, Elizaveta Kerimova, approached me. "Welcome to the family, dear," she said with a smile that held a note of coldness. "I hope you make my son happy." I responded with an equally polite smile, "I'll do my best, Elizaveta Viktorovna." Before our honeymoon, I noticed Ruslan's satisfied face. He was gleeful, and something unpleasant twisted in my chest. For him, it was all a game. The first years of marriage were interesting. We lived in a house gifted by Elder's father, beautiful and luxurious, but never truly cozy. It felt more like an expensive hotel. I tried to push Elder towards something more meaningful, to prove that there were things in life more important than parties and expensive watches. Over time, he changed, spending less time with friends and more time in the office. One day, I saw Ruslan looking at Elder with pride as he sorted through company documents. For the first time, I thought that maybe this marriage wasn't entirely in vain. But Elizaveta remained unchanged. "What an interesting dress, Yulia," she would say with polite approval that made me want to grip my glass tightly. I would just smile and say, "Thank you, Elizaveta Viktorovna." Then something unexpected happened. We sat in the doctor's office on a cold autumn day. The doctor hesitated before speaking. "I'm sorry," he finally said, but your husband cannot have children. I listened in stunned silence. That night I lay awake, thinking about my parents. My father was happy, his business was thriving, and his income had doubled. But at what cost? I had married for his sake, but I wanted to work, not just be someone's wife. When I told Elder, he looked genuinely surprised. Why? He asked. We have enough money. It's not about the money, I said. I want to do something important. He shook his head as if I had said something absurd. In our circle, wives don't work, he said. They do charity work. Open a foundation. And so the Julia Kirimova Foundation was born, helping children with cancer. It wasn't exactly what I dreamed of, but it gave me a purpose. Elder seemed indifferent, and we lived together but apart, sharing space but not our lives. 10 years passed, and then everything changed again. Elder became the head of the company overnight. I saw the pressure weighing on him. He tried to appear confident, but he wasn't ready. Too much responsibility, too many expectations. And then, as they say, trouble never comes alone. Elizaveta Viktorovna seemed to lose her will to live after her husband's death. Her once sharp gaze dulled, and she sat in her dark living room, unresponsive to the world around her. She slipped into depression, and at first, she dismissed it as age and nerves. But the pain grew worse, and when she finally agreed to see a doctor, the diagnosis was grim cancer. Elder sat across from the doctor, his face expressionless. She needs to be transferred to a good center where she can be cared for, the doctor said. But Elizaveta firmly refused. I will die in my own home, she said with unyielding pride. There was no point in arguing. Very well, I said. We will do as you wish. I didn't know what awaited us, but one thing was clear, this story was far from over. The woman who had never liked me now depended on me entirely. I hired nurses, oversaw her treatment, and spent hours by her bedside. Over time, I noticed a change. One day, as I adjusted her pillow, she said, "Forgive me for not seeing this before." I was taken aback and could only nod. Thank you, Elizaveta Viktorovna. Life went on. 5 years had passed since Elder took over the company. I wish I could say things improved, but that would be a lie. He became irritable and unpredictable. One day, his assistant called me. I'm sorry to bother you, Yulia, she said. But your husband hasn't been to the office for several days. Is everything all right? I hung up without a word and waited. That night, Elder came home drunk. What's going on, Elder? I asked calmly. I've been getting calls from the office. You haven't been to work. He sneered bitterly. What's the point? He said. The company is bankrupt. In desperation, I turned to my father. Although he had long since retired, he agreed to help for my sake. He took Elder under his wing, giving him a position as deputy director, hoping it would set him straight. But Elder barely showed up for work, arriving late and leaving early. I saw my father's sales plummet and his life's work crumbling. One evening when Elder came home drunk again, I couldn't take it anymore. Elder, we need to talk, I said firmly. He looked at me with annoyance. Oh, so now it's my fault. He snapped. You're ruining your father's business. He laughed bitterly. I never wanted this life, the marriage, the company. I'm just waiting for my mother to die so I can sell her house and leave. I stared at him in disbelief. How can you say that? She's your mother. Don't pretend to be a saint, he hissed. We both know this marriage is a sham. You want to escape as much as I do. I turned away, unable to look at him. That night, I lay awake, my thoughts racing. What should I do? How could I live with someone who could so easily dismiss everything, even his own family? And then, as often happens when you think things can't get any worse, life proved me wrong. One day, the phone rang. As soon as I answered, I felt a chill. The voice on the other end was cold and unfamiliar. I'm sorry, it said. Your parents. They're plain. They were on their way to a second honeymoon. They're gone. I stood by their graves, feeling more alone than ever. I had hoped Elder would be by my side, but he didn't even attend the funeral. My sadness turned to anger. The next day, I went to my father's office, which was now mine. But as I entered, I froze. Elder was sprawled in my father's chair. "We need to talk," I said, struggling to contain my fury. He glanced at me nonchalantly. "Again," he said coldly. "You know, Yulia," he drawled, "this company is worth about $5 million. And while you were running around to lawyers, I had myself appointed temporary manager." I felt a chill. He leaned back in the chair and smirked. "The inheritance process takes months, and while you sit and wait, I'm in charge." He turned to the computer and pressed a few keys. On the screen, a large sum of money was being transferred from the corporate account to his personal one. I was stunned. "You can't do this," I said. "It's a crime." He laughed. "And who's going to stop me?" "A poor little girl who didn't even bother to finalize the paperwork." He smirked lazily. "So, Yulia, you can go ahead and file for divorce. By the time it goes to court, I'll be long gone." I was speechless. "And the money?" I finally managed to ask. He grinned smugly. "There are ways to make it disappear. There's nothing you can do." He stood up and buttoned his jacket. "So you can run to the police, sue me for years, it won't change anything." I turned and left, holding back tears. But with each step, I realized that this was probably the end, but it might also be a new beginning. After that meeting, I never saw Elder again. He disappeared as if he had never existed. A few days later, when all the documents were ready, I went to Maxim Zakharov, my father's lawyer, to sign the papers. "It's official," he said, handing me a folder. "The company is now yours." "And what about the debts?" I asked without looking up. "Debts are a solvable problem if approached wisely," he said, his gaze steady and assessing. "I know an excellent business consultant who can help." I hesitated, but before I could say anything, Zakharov pulled out an old phone from his desk. "There's something else," he said. He turned on the phone and played a video. My parents appeared on the screen, holding hands and smiling, but their eyes held a knowing sadness. Behind them, a muffled noise grew louder, followed by a sharp jolt. Oxygen masks dangled in the frame. My father's voice was calm but tense. "We don't know what's happening," he said, "but if you're watching this, something must have gone wrong." My mother nodded, gripping his hand. "Soothart, if I could, I would hug you right now," she said. My father looked into the camera again. "Listen, Yulia, you are strong. You will handle this. Everything we built is now yours. Don't let anyone decide for you," my mother added. Someone screamed in the background, and the video cut out. I sat motionless, clutching the phone. The warmth from the screen seemed to carry their final words. Taking a deep breath, I wiped away my tears. "So about that consultant," I said calmly, setting the phone aside. Zakharov smiled. "I've already arranged a meeting for tomorrow." I closed the folder and stood up. "Then let's begin," I said. "I can't say that life teaches us fairness, but it certainly gives us a chance to take revenge, and I took it." After Elder's disappearance, I worked tirelessly to understand the intricacies of running a business. I couldn't afford to give up, not after losing my parents and the illusion of a family. And then Elizaveta Viktorovna passed away, quietly and almost painlessly. I sat by her side, holding her cold, weak hand. "Forgive me," she whispered. "I should have seen this sooner." I nodded silently, unable to speak. "Thank you, Elizaveta Viktorovna." I used the money she left me to pay off the company's debts and donated the rest to the Children's Cancer Fund. I wanted to turn at least a small part of my pain into something useful. And then the news broke. According to eyewitnesses, Elder had bet that he could speed up a jet ski, jump off it while it was moving, and swim to shore safely. He made the bet and dove into the dark sea with a strong current. His friends waited for him to surface with a victorious shout, but he never did. His body was found days later, barely recognizable. The official cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation in water. Other reports blamed alcohol and risky behavior for the businessman's tragic end. People called and asked if I had seen the news, but I felt nothing. It was as if I was reading about a stranger. Maybe he was just a passing episode in my life, not a husband, not a friend, not an enemy, just someone who happened to cross my path. Life went on. The company got back on its feet, and I didn't allow myself to dwell on the past. But one thing remained with me, a fear of airplanes. I couldn't bring myself to fly again. I held meetings online and took vacations by train. Even when I was invited to a business conference overseas, I sent my deputy instead. Sometimes people told me, "Yulia, you need to overcome your fear." Maybe they were right, but I just couldn't do it. The image of my parents clasped hands in their final moments and their voices saying, "We love you," was still too vivid. I had managed to rebuild the company, find myself, and create a new life, but airplanes remained a challenge I couldn't conquer. And you know what? That's okay.